The life of a cook in medieval Europe was a whirlwind of embers, spices, sweat, and pressure, served with a generous dose of ingenuity and a pinch of desperation. Picture a world where the kitchen was not just a place to prepare food, but a battlefield where fire, time, and the whims of nobles dictated the rhythm. Medieval cooks, those unsung heroes of pots and spits, didn't just feed bodies. They shaped the culture, economy, and even the politics of their time. Their profession, though often undervalued, was an art that demanded a blend of technical skill, boundless creativity, and near supernatural patience. Join me as we explore this fascinating universe, where the aroma of freshly baked bread mingled with chaos, ambition, and occasionally, the smell of a stew gone wrong. To understand the life of a medieval cook, we must first set the stage in the context of the era, roughly spanning the 5th to the 15th centuries. 1,000 years of transformation, wars, plagues, and banquets that could make or break reputations. Medieval society was divided into rigid estates: nobles, clergy, and peasants, with cooks occupying a peculiar place in this hierarchy. They were certainly not nobles, but neither were they mere peasants. Their social status depended largely on where they worked and for whom. A cook in a humble village lived a radically different life from one employed in a castle, a monastery, or, in the later Middle Ages, a wealthy bourgeois household in a growing city. Yet, they all shared a universal truth. Their work was essential, but they were rarely seen as more than the ones who make the food. And yet, without them, the medieval world would have crumbled faster than a poorly baked pie. Let's start with the villages, the heart of medieval Europe, where the vast majority of the population lived. Here, being a cook wasn't necessarily a formal profession, but a role often taken on by the women of the household or a designated community figure responsible for preparing food for collective events like harvests or religious festivals. Village kitchens were rustic spaces, sometimes just an open fire or a stone hearth in a hut. Fire was the soul of the kitchen, and mastering it was a skill that separated novices from experts. A good cook knew how to keep the embers alive, adjust the heat with wet or dry wood, and prevent a stew from turning to charcoal. Because, trust me, nothing ruined a medieval meal faster than a burnt dish, especially when the entire village depended on it to survive another day. Fire wasn't just a tool. It was a capricious companion that could be your best friend or worst enemy. A moment's inattention, a misplaced log, or an unexpected gust of wind could turn a promising stew into a charred disaster, and the cook had to remain ever vigilant, senses sharp as a hawk's. Bread was the cornerstone of the village diet, and preparing it was a titanic task. This wasn't the artisanal bread you'd buy today at a trendy bakery for the price of a kidney. It was dense, often made from a mix of wheat, rye, barley, or, in times of scarcity, less appetizing ingredients like acorns or ground bark. The process began with grinding the grain, which could be done by hand with a mortar or at a communal mill, where the miller took a portion of the grain as payment. This practice, known as multure, was often a source of tension, as millers weren't always honest, and many a village cook had to fight tooth and nail to ensure they got enough grain back. Then came kneading, an arm-shattering exercise, followed by fermentation, if yeast was available, which wasn't always the case. Yeast didn't come in neat packets like today. It was often sourced from beer foam or a carefully maintained sourdough starter, a treasure families guarded like gold. Finally, the bread was baked in a communal oven or the household hearth. If the bread turned out too hard or rancid, the cook faced the village's withering glares. Nobody wanted to chew on a loaf that felt like a rock, but sometimes there was no choice. In the worst times, when grain was scarce, cooks had to mix flour with bran, husks, or even edible clay to stretch resources, resulting in breads that were more punishment than pleasure. Beyond bread, soups and stews were the soul of village cooking. These dishes were practical, allowing cooks to use whatever was at hand: a wilted cabbage, a handful of barley, a forgotten bone, or wild herbs gathered from the forest. Creativity was key. A skilled cook could turn scraps into something that, if not exactly delicious, at least filled the stomach. Spices like pepper or cloves were a luxury reserved for the wealthy, so village cooks relied on local herbs like thyme, rosemary, sage, or even nettles for flavor. Nettles, by the way, were a star ingredient in times of need. Though prickly to the touch, once cooked, they became a nutritious vegetable with a mild spinach-like flavor and the added bonus of being free if you knew where to look. In times of famine, which were more common than we'd like to think, cooks had to get even more inventive. No meat? Here's a root stew. No grain? Try this tree bark soup. Yes, you read that right. In desperate times, ground bark, acorns, or even moss could become food. It wasn't a feast, but it kept people alive. Village cooks were, in essence, alchemists of survival, transforming what nature or poverty provided into something that, hopefully, didn't provoke too many complaints. Village cooks were also masters of preservation, an essential art in a world without refrigerators. They salted meat, dried fish, pickled vegetables, and made primitive jams from wild fruits like blackberries or currants. These techniques not only ensured food lasted through the winter, but also added variety to an otherwise monotonous diet. For example, a skilled cook could turn a pig slaughtered in autumn into a stockpile of salted hams, sausages, and bacon that would feed a family for months. Salting was a delicate process. Too much salt could ruin the meat, while too little could leave it vulnerable to mold. Cooks also used techniques like smoking, hanging strips of meat or fish over a low fire to infuse them with a smoky flavor that preserved and enhanced their taste. Pickling vegetables in vinegar or brine was another common practice, and village cooks often experimented with local herbs and spices to give their pickles a distinctive touch. These skills were not only practical but also gave cooks a special status in the community, as a winter without preserved food could mean death for many. Life in the village wasn't just hard work. There were also moments of celebration where cooks shone. Religious festivals like Easter, Christmas, or the village patron saint's day were opportunities for cooks to showcase their talents. On these occasions, the community came together to share what they had, and the cook was at the center of attention, though not always receiving the recognition they deserved. Preparing a communal feast required meticulous planning, calculating how 25 much food was needed, ensuring ingredients were fresh, and coordinating helpers to have everything ready on time. A roasted pig, a fruit pie, or a hearty soup could become the heart of the celebration, and a cook who managed to impress their neighbors with a memorable dish could earn a place in village lore. However, these feasts also highlighted the era's inequalities. While peasants ate hard bread and porridge, nobles enjoyed delicacies that village cooks could only dream of preparing. Now, let's move from the village to the castle, where the world of the medieval cook transformed into something far grander but infinitely more stressful. Castle kitchens were true production hubs, like medieval factories where chaos and precision went hand in hand. Imagine a vast hall with a roaring fire at its center, giant pots hanging from chains, spits turning with whole deer or boars, and an army of helpers rushing about, sweating and shouting orders. The head cook, often called the master cook, was the general of this culinary battlefield. Their authority in the kitchen was absolute, but they also bore an immense responsibility. A failed banquet could humiliate their lord before his guests, and in the Middle Ages, food was far more than sustenance. It was a tool of power, a display of wealth, and a diplomatic weapon. A successful banquet could seal an alliance between noble families, while a poorly executed dish could spark a dispute that, in the worst cases, led to war. Yes, food held that kind of power, and the cook bore the weight of that responsibility. Medieval banquets were events worthy of a Hollywood script. They weren't just about eating, but about impressing. Nobles used the table to showcase their wealth, influence, and sophistication. A castle cook had to be more than a cook. They were an artist, a chemist, a choreographer, and, at times, a magician. Dishes had to be visually stunning. As in the Middle Ages, food entered through the eyes first. It wasn't uncommon for a cook to present a roasted swan with its feathers reattached to look alive, or a giant pie from which live birds flew out when cut. Yes, live birds. The Middle Ages had no Netflix or TikTok, so guests had to be entertained with more than just good taste. These surprise dishes, known as entremets, were a hallmark of high medieval cuisine, and a cook who elicited an ooh from the diners earned a place in the court's memory. Some of these dishes were so elaborate they required days of preparation. For instance, a cook might spend hours molding a jelly into the shape of a castle or sewing a peacock's feathers back on to make it appear intact on the table. These feats demanded not only culinary skill, but also a theatrical flair that rivaled that of minstrels. The noble diet was far more varied than that of peasants, though not necessarily healthier. Meat was the king of the table, and castle cooks specialized in preparing venison, boar, pheasant, peacock, heron, and even bear in some northern European regions. Each type of meat required specific treatment. Venison, for example, needed to be marinated for days to soften its strong flavor, while boar required slow roasting to make the meat tender. Cooks also had to deal with the logistics of sourcing these meats, often from hunts organized by the lord or his vassals. If the hunt failed, the cook had to improvise with whatever was in the pantry, from a domestic pig to a last-minute rabbit. Fish was also crucial, especially during religious fasting days when meat, dairy, and eggs were forbidden by the church. These days, which included Lent, Fridays, and other liturgical dates, forced cooks to get creative. Preparing a banquet without meat or dairy was a challenge, but elite cooks had tricks up their sleeves. For example, they used almond paste to create fake eggs or plant-based milk, or transformed salted fish into dishes that looked as luxurious as a roast. The ability to navigate these restrictions without sacrificing flavor distinguished a good cook from a great one. Spices were the true luxury in noble cuisine. Saffron, pepper, cloves, cinnamon, and ginger weren't just seasonings. They were status symbols, sometimes more valuable than gold. A pound of saffron could cost more than a cook's annual salary, and pepper was so prized it was occasionally used as currency. These spices reached Europe from distant lands like India, Southeast Asia, or the Middle East via trade routes controlled by Arab, Venetian, or Genoese merchants. The journey of a spice from its origin to a noble's table could take months, crossing deserts, seas, and mountains, which added to its value and exotic allure. A cook working for a noble had to know how to use these spices with precision, as a mistake could be catastrophic. Too much pepper in a stew could ruin it, and an angry lord over a poorly spiced dish was as dangerous as a knight with a sword. On the other hand, masterful use of spices could elevate a simple dish to a masterpiece, earning the court's applause. For instance, a red wine sauce with a hint of cloves and cinnamon could transform a basic meat dish into an experience fit for a king. Working in a castle kitchen was not for the faint of heart. The days were grueling, starting before dawn and ending well into the night. Cooks worked in extreme conditions. The heat from the ovens was stifling, smoke irritated eyes and lungs, and knives, spits, and boiling pots could cause serious injuries. A slip in the kitchen could mean a lost finger or a burn that would stay with you for life. Castle kitchens were designed for efficiency, not comfort. The floor, often stone or packed earth, was slippery with grease and water spills, and the air was thick with smoke and steam. Cooks had to move with the precision of a dancer to avoid accidents while shouting orders to their assistants and overseeing half a dozen dishes at once. The head cook also had to coordinate a team of helpers, from apprentices peeling vegetables to those turning spits for hours, an exhausting job often left to the youngest or least skilled. The head cook needed to be a charismatic leader, capable of staying calm while the entire castle awaited a flawless banquet for 100 hungry guests. In monasteries, a cook's life had a different flavor but was no less demanding. Monks followed strict rules about food, rooted in austerity, discipline, and obedience to church laws. However, not all monasteries were equally Spartan. Wealthier ones, especially those of orders like the Benedictines or Cistercians, had kitchens that rivaled those of castles in equipment and output. Monastic cooks had to balance religious rules with the practical need to feed a large community, which might include not only monks but also pilgrims, workers, and high-ranking guests. During fasting days, creativity was essential. Salted fish, lentils, porridge, and vegetables were the staples, but a skilled cook could transform these humble ingredients into dishes that, while not luxurious, were at least appetizing. For example, a lentil soup with a touch of fennel and onion could be surprisingly comforting, while a dish of desalinated fish with an herb sauce could rival the best meat dishes. A fascinating aspect of monastic cuisine was its connection to medicine. In the Middle Ages, food was closely tied to health, based on the theory of humors, a belief inherited from Greek medicine that the body was composed of 4 substances: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, that needed to be balanced. Monastery cooks often worked with herbalist monks or physicians to create dishes that not only nourished but also healed. For instance, a stew with certain herbs might be prepared for someone with an excess of phlegm, while a spicy dish could be prescribed to stimulate yellow bile. This made cooks a sort of proto-nutritionists, though without the title or recognition. Some monasteries even grew their own medicinal herb gardens, and cooks learned to use plants like rue, fennel, mint, or sage not only for flavor but for their supposed health benefits. For example, sage was considered good for memory, while rosemary was used to relieve headaches. These beliefs, though not always backed by modern science, reflected a surprisingly advanced holistic approach to food for the time. The path to becoming a medieval cook was no walk in the park. There were no culinary schools, no recipe books with precise measurements, no YouTube tutorials. Knowledge was passed from master to apprentice, often through years of hard work, observation, and, in many cases, shouting. A young aspiring cook started as an assistant, performing thankless tasks like scrubbing pots, peeling onions until their eyes burned, or turning a spit for hours until their arms ached. These tasks were not only physically exhausting but also mentally challenging, as the apprentice had to endure constant criticism from their master. A good master cook was often a tyrant in the kitchen, but also a mentor who taught their apprentices the trade secrets, from how to slice an onion without waste to how to gauge the exact moment to pull a pie from the oven. If the apprentice showed talent, patience, and a thick enough skin to withstand the criticism, they could rise to more significant roles, like preparing sauces, overseeing an oven, or even designing a dish for a banquet. In castles, the most promising apprentices had the chance to travel with their master to other realms, learning foreign recipes and techniques to add to their repertoire. For example, a French cook traveling to Italy might discover the art of making meat-filled pies, while an English cook in Spain could learn to use oranges and almonds in their dishes. Women also played a crucial role in medieval cooking, though their contributions were often overlooked. In villages, women were primarily responsible for cooking for the family and community, preparing everything from daily bread to stews for communal feasts. These women not only cooked but also managed household resources, ensuring food lasted year-round. In castles, some women worked as cooks or assistants, specializing in tasks like baking, preserving, or making sweets, which gained popularity toward the end of the Middle Ages. Baking, in particular, was an art requiring near-scientific precision, as cooks worked with expensive ingredients like sugar or almonds that couldn't be wasted. However, the most prestigious roles, like master cook, were typically reserved for men, not because women were less capable, but because the patriarchal system of the time limited their opportunities. Despite this, many women left their mark on medieval cuisine, especially in bourgeois urban households, where their skills were highly valued. In cities, some women even started their own businesses, selling pies, bread, or jams in markets, a testament to their ingenuity and determination in a male-dominated world. The life of a medieval cook was full of challenges but also moments of creativity and pride. A successful banquet could be the talk of the court for weeks, and a talented cook could earn their lord's favor, sometimes translating into better working conditions or even a slight status boost. In castles, a cook who impressed a king or bishop with an innovative dish might receive a reward, like a purse of coins, a new cloak, or even a small plot of land. However, failure could be devastating. A poorly executed dish could enrage a noble, and in extreme cases, a cook might be sacked or punished. There were even, likely exaggerated, stories of cooks thrown into dungeons for ruining an important banquet. The pressure was real, and the kitchen was a place where a single mistake could be costly. For instance, if a cook used too much pepper in a dish for a noble who disliked strong flavors, they might face the wrath of the entire court. One apocryphal chronicle tells of an English cook forced to eat a burnt pie in front of guests as punishment for their error, a humiliation that likely haunted them for life. Medieval food also reflected the era's social and economic tensions. In times of plenty, cooks could experiment with exotic ingredients and elaborate techniques. In times of scarcity, their work was more about survival. During the Crusades, for example, cooks accompanying armies had to improvise with whatever they found in foreign lands, often incorporating ingredients like dates, figs, or rosewater into their recipes. These foreign influences enriched medieval cuisine, especially in the more cosmopolitan courts of Italy, Spain, and southern France, where cultural exchanges were more frequent. In Sicily, for instance, cooks blended Christian, Jewish, and Islamic techniques to create dishes like couscous with meat or almond sweets, which delighted even the most discerning palates. These cultural blends not only expanded cooks' repertoires but also laid the groundwork for modern gastronomy, much of which is a product of fused traditions. As the Middle Ages progressed, the profession of cook began to professionalize. In the 14th century, the first cookbooks appeared, like the Viandier by Taillevent, a French cook who served several kings. These weren't cookbooks as we know them today, with precise measurements and cooking times. They were more like general guides for cooks who already knew their craft. For example, a recipe might say, take a capon, roast it until golden, and serve it with a wine sauce. The rest was up to the cook's experience. The Viandier and similar texts show that medieval cooks were not just kitchen technicians but innovators. They experimented with flavor combinations that might seem strange today, like meat with sugar or fish with almonds. They also developed techniques that remain fundamental, like using a roux to thicken sauces or preparing broths from bones. These innovations laid the foundation for modern gastronomy, though medieval cooks rarely got the credit they deserved. In terms of tools, medieval cooks worked with basic but ingenious equipment. Knives were essential, and a good cook treated their knives like jewels. A sharp knife could make the difference between a clean cut and a disaster, and cooks often sharpened them themselves using whetstones they carried. Iron or ceramic pots, mortars for grinding spices, and spits for roasting were part of the daily arsenal. In more advanced kitchens, there were even rudimentary ventilation systems, like wide chimneys or roof openings, to prevent smoke from choking the workers. However, the lack of modern technology meant everything depended on the cook's skill and instinct. A thermometer would have been an impossible dream. Medieval cooks gauged oven temperature by cautiously sticking a hand inside or counting how many seconds they could withstand the heat before burning. It was a crude method, but it worked. Some cooks even developed tricks to measure heat, like tossing a pinch of flour into the oven and watching how it burned. If it browned slowly, the oven was ready. If it charred instantly, it needed to cool. The relationship between cooks and their lords was also complex. A talented cook could become a local celebrity, especially if their dishes impressed high-ranking guests. In larger courts, like those in France or England, head cooks were respected figures, sometimes even consulted by their lord on non-culinary matters. For example, a cook who knew a foreign ambassador's preferences could help their lord plan a banquet to aid diplomatic negotiations. However, cooks were also at the mercy of their lord's whims. If a noble decided they wanted a banquet for 100 people with only a day's notice, the cook had to work miracles. And if the lord was in a bad mood, any small mistake could become a catastrophe. Stories abound of cooks forced to eat the remains of their failed dishes as punishment after a disastrous banquet. We don't know how much of this is myth, but it gives an idea of the pressure they faced. In cities, cooks also began forming guilds, especially toward the end of the Middle Ages. These guilds regulated the profession, setting quality standards and protecting cooks from unfair competition. For example, a guild might decree that only certified cooks could sell food in the market, ensuring a certain level of quality but also limiting new talent, especially women and those who couldn't afford training costs. In cities like Paris or London, cook guilds were so powerful they even influenced local laws on food sales, ensuring street vendors didn't compete with their members. In summary, being a cook in the Middle Ages was far more than stirring a pot. It was a craft requiring skill, creativity, and fireproof resilience, literally. Whether in a humble village, a bustling castle, or a quiet monastery, Medieval cooks were the magicians behind the curtain, turning simple ingredients into dishes that nourished, delighted, and sometimes changed the course of history. Their work, though often invisible, was the foundation of modern cuisine, and their legacy lives on in every dish we prepare with care and creativity. The next time you bite into a crusty loaf or savor a spiced stew, think of those cooks who, with little more than a fire and a dream, made the magic of the table possible.